Economics is a difficult topic, so much so that experts can't even agree on the basic principles of the subject. There's a hilarious joke among economics nerds that if you put two economists in a room, you'll get three opinions. So that is to say that economic policy and decision making can be really tricky to get right. Sometimes it goes well, sometimes it goes not so well, but sometimes it goes so horrendously badly that it's worth talking about in a YouTube video. So in this video, we'll run down 4 of the worst economic blunders the world has ever seen, and we'll talk about the lessons we can learn from each one. And to start with, we're going to go all the way back to the 1930s and talk about an American policy that you might have heard about on the news recently. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act was an act of Congress which was signed into law by President Herbert Hoover back in June 1930. Essentially, the act was a tariff package which placed tariffs on over 20,000 imported goods into the US and was intended to shield American industries from foreign competition. Under the new tariffs, the average tariff rate on all imports into the US rose from 13.5% in 1929 up to almost 20% in 1933. And this might not sound like a lot, but in practical terms it really is. And it represents a huge policy reversal and undid much of the progress towards free trade that the US had achieved since the end of the First World War. Now inevitably, other countries were not happy with this act, and it sparked a full-blown trade war with America and some of its closest trading partners, with retaliatory tariffs coming from countries like Canada, Mexico, Italy, France, Spain and Australia, just to name a few. And the economic consequences of the Smoot-Hawley Act and the subsequent trade war were pretty devastating. Between 1929 and 1933, US imports fell by a staggering 66% and exports fell by 61%, with US gross national product also decreasing by a massive 46% over the same period. Now, it must be said that by the time the Act came into force, the Great Depression was already underway, so it's difficult to say how much of these declines are directly attributable to Smoot-Hawley, but most historians and economists will agree that the tariffs worsened the existing crisis by devastating global trade and greatly reducing employment in export-driven industries. The act also didn't end well for President Hoover himself, who lost the 1932 election to a monumental landslide, showing the American public's disdain for the tariffs and for Hoover's poor running of the economy more generally. So what can we learn from the Smoot-Hawley Act? Well, a hell of a lot really, especially in the times we currently live in. Firstly, tariffs and protectionism tend not to work out the way that policymakers intend, as all it really achieves is pissing off your closest trading partners and having big retaliatory tariffs slapped back against you, which we've literally just seen happen today in 2025. And secondly, listening to what economists have to say is usually a pretty good idea if you're a policymaker. In the case of Smoot-Hawley, a petition was signed by over 1,000 economists calling for President Hoover to veto the legislation. And as we mentioned before, it's difficult to get economists to agree on anything. So if you've got over 1,000 of them telling you that something's a bad idea, it might be worth actually listening to them. And to continue with our theme of terrible economic policy, we now turn to Mao's China in the 1950s, who gives us our next economic blunder. The Great Leap Forward was an ambitious economic campaign launched by Chairman Mao Zedong of China back in 1958. The overall aim of the campaign was to transform China from an agrarian and agricultural society to a modern communist industrial economy as quickly as possible, with Mao stating the aim of overtaking the economy of the United Kingdom within 15 years. Now, this all sounds pretty innocent. I mean, there's nothing wrong with a bit of ambition. What could possibly go wrong? Well, as it turns out, quite a lot. And things went very wrong very quickly. In fact, the Great Leap Forward was so catastrophic that it directly caused the Great Chinese Famine of 1959 to 1961, in which anywhere between 15 to 55 million people ended up starving to death. So what the hell went wrong? How did an ambitious economic policy end up being so disastrous? Well, the problem really started when the communist government started to collectivise the Chinese countryside into what they called people's communes. Essentially, the small farms, which had been run by families and small communities for centuries, were gradually taken over by the government and replaced with these state-owned and state-run farms, or communes, which the Chinese rural population were forced to work on. And by 1958, private ownership was completely abolished and was replaced entirely by these communes. The main theory was that these small family-run farms were inefficient, and the Chinese state could produce way more food as a whole if they were to collectivise the whole process by transforming the agricultural sector into these state-owned and state-operated farms. Now, this policy by itself probably wouldn't have been super catastrophic, but what really started to cause problems was the diversion of labour away from these rural communities into cities and into the new industrial projects which started to ramp up around the same time. For example, one of Mao's new industrial projects was the widespread use of backyard furnaces, which were makeshift steel furnaces which were literally set up in people's backyards, with the aim of increasing steel production in the country. However, this project backfired massively, as firstly, it diverted an absolute ton of labour and resources away from the country's agricultural sector, and secondly, it produced a terrible quality finished product, much of which was virtually useless. So by late 1958, it was becoming clear that the Great Leap Forward wasn't going well at all. The agricultural communes were proving to be much less productive than the old system, and the new industrial projects were producing majorly inferior products to the rest of the world. And what's more, the massive diversion of labour away from rural farming communities to industrial cities was putting huge pressure on the food production within the country. It was only thanks to exceptionally good weather and a bumper harvest in 1958 that the Chinese escaped real problems that year. So what do the Communist Party officials do? Do they do the sensible thing and report these problems directly up to Mao? Absolutely not. You see, if you're a party official and you decide to make the harvest and industrial output numbers look more favourable than they actually are, then you're much more likely to be treated well within the party and promoted quickly than if you do the proper thing and just report the correct data that you collect. And as a result, the problems that were experienced in 1958 were not corrected, and by the time of the harvest of 1959, when the food shortages really started to manifest, there simply wasn't enough grain to go around. But unfortunately, it had already been agreed how much food was going to be taken from the farms themselves into the cities to feed the urban population. And as no one wanted to report the food shortages up the party chain to Mao, the party officials simply took basically the whole harvest of 1959 from the rural areas to the cities, leaving virtually nothing for the rural population to eat. And as the party were never going to admit their mistakes to the rest of the world, all foreign aid was refused. So here we have it, a perfect storm of awful central planning and perverse incentives dialed up to the max, resulting in one of the largest famines in human history. Estimates of the final death toll vary wildly, but it's generally accepted that anywhere between 15 to 55 million people died as a direct result of the Great Leap Forward and the Great Chinese Famine. So this one's really quite depressing and goes to show just how bad things can get when economic policy isn't thought through properly, and when party officials are incentivised to suppress the truth and instead promote a false reality which just doesn't exist. Anyways, moving on to something a bit more light-hearted now, we're going to take a trip over to the Netherlands, all the way back in the 1600s. Now, we've all seen speculative price bubbles before, the irrational buying of an asset that's apparently going to the moon before the bubble bursts and the price comes crashing back down to earth, with a lot of people losing a shit ton of money in the process. NFTs, meme coins, and stocks like GameStop are probably the best examples today, but price bubbles have been around for many years. We had a house price bubble in the mid-2000s, a dot-com bubble just before that, and going back all the way to the 1920s, we had the stock market bubble. But when economists think of price bubbles, there's always a special place in their heart for the original one, and the one that sounds probably the most ridiculous of them all, the Dutch Tulip Mania bubble. So for a bit of context, tulips are flowers which are native to Turkey and the mountains of Central Asia, and most likely made their way over to Amsterdam in the mid-1500s via trade with the Ottoman Empire. And as they looked so different to any of the native flowers of Western Europe, they instantly became the height of fashion in the Netherlands and were a very strong status symbol. To add to this, the Dutch were getting really creative when it came to their finance. They pioneered some of the first joint stock companies and financial products such as futures contracts. So it's the early 1600s, and the growing middle and upper classes of the country were becoming more and more obsessed with tulips. You just need to take a look at some of the artwork from the time to realise how obsessed they were with these flowers. And as we enter the 1630s, some of the rarest and most desirable tulips were becoming ridiculously expensive. Some were even selling for thousands of guilders. And for context, a skilled artisan in the country could only expect to earn around 300 guilders per year. But the bubble really started to get going when the speculators entered the market, who made use of the newly invented futures contracts, which effectively allowed them to buy and sell tulips without actually owning the flowers themselves. And by the mid-1630s, the speculation and price growth was reaching its peak, with some sources saying that tulip prices rose by up to 10 times between November 1636 and February 1637. But as we've all seen before with price bubbles, this excitement quickly turned to fear, and by the middle of February 1637, the demand for tulips quickly dried up and the bubble burst, leaving many speculators and growers with empty pockets and a lot of egg on their face. But to be fair, although it's been bigged up over the years, many modern historians agree that the economic fallout of tulip mania was actually pretty limited. But it does provide an interesting story and cautionary tale around asset bubbles, which, as we know, are happening more and more frequently nowadays. So the next time you hear about some random NFT or meme coin that's apparently going to the moon, just keep in the back of your mind these lot, who lost their fortunes by riding the wave of hype and FOMO buying, all for it to come crashing down overnight. But unlike Tulip Mania, our final economic blunder does have very far-reaching consequences, up to $30 trillion worth of losses by some estimates, and that is the 2008 global financial crisis. The 2008 financial crisis is one of the largest and most widespread economic catastrophes the world has ever seen, with some models estimating the fallout to have caused 30 million job losses worldwide, with the total economic cost estimated at between 20 to 30 trillion dollars. So what the hell happened? Well, the whole crisis is a complicated and nuanced topic, but to get a decent grasp of what happened, you really only need to understand 5 key things. Number 1, before around 1980, the global financial industry was highly regulated, but during the 80s, 90s and early 2000s, it was very quickly deregulated. Leaders like Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher and Bill Clinton worked hard to remove many of the artificial barriers that were placed on banks and financial companies in order to improve efficiency and drive economic growth. And this was working very well over the short term, and over the course of a number of years, the global financial industry became extremely interconnected and globalised, and became something of a web of global finance. And this worked very well over the short term, and over the course of a number of years, the global financial industry became extremely globalised and interconnected, and created something of a web of global finance. Number 2, a record number of Americans, even those with bad credit, had access to mortgages for the very first time. Thanks to the deregulation, banks had much more freedom to give out mortgages to new homeowners, and as the years went by, they started lending to riskier and riskier mortgage candidates, i.e. people on lower incomes or with a bad credit rating, who were more likely to default on the debt. These were known as subprime mortgages and were riskier as they were more likely to enter default, i.e. the homeowner was more likely to go bankrupt and fail to repay the whole of the mortgage back. Number 3, big investment banks used financial engineering techniques and a corrupt risk rating system to hide the real risk of these subprime mortgages. Essentially, investment banks like Goldman Sachs or Lehman Brothers would take these risky subprime mortgages and package them into products such as mortgage-backed securities or collateralized debt obligations, or CDOs, and would essentially bribe ratings agencies such as Standard & Poor's and Moody's to independently review the risk of these investments, and the ratings agencies would just give them a AAA rating or a super low risk rating, when in reality they were incredibly risky investments and was something of a ticking time bomb. Number 4, these super risky investment products were incredibly popular with investors around the world. Now, these mortgage-backed securities and CDOs were incredibly popular with investors, as all they saw was a very nice return on an investment which was apparently AAA rated, or rated as very low risk. And so these products proliferated around the world very quickly and entered the web of global finance. Number 5, once the American housing bubble burst and default rates started to skyrocket, the MBSs and CBOs all began to fail and panic started to set in around the world. Once the dominoes started to fall, the whole global financial system started to fall apart. Banks stopped lending and all lines of credit dried up, stock markets around the world collapsed as investors panicked, and business and consumer confidence fell off a cliff. Not to mention that the investment banks at the heart of the crisis started to lose tens of billions of dollars, with the most high-profile bankruptcy being the collapse of Lehman Brothers, who filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy on the 15th of September 2008. And as the dust settled, economies around the world felt the effects of the crisis for years after, with some of the aftershocks still evident to this day. Now, this has obviously been a quick whistle-stop tour of a very complicated topic, but if you're interested in learning more about the 2008 crisis, then be sure to take a look at my previous video, where I discuss it in much more detail. Links on screen now. And obviously, I've only spoke about 4 economic blunders in this video, and there are plenty more which I could talk about. So leave me a comment below if you'd like to see another one of these videos made, and let me know of the blunders you'd like me to talk about in the next one. And if you've enjoyed this video, then please leave me a like and consider subscribing to the channel, as we've got plenty more videos on the topics of the economy and investing, and many more in the works to come. Thanks for watching.